So yeah, I think good afternoon to everyone, and thanks for hopping on today's event. And thanks to your group for giving the opportunity to present something which I have done before. So I'm going to talk about today single sign-on solution for Salesforce. There are variety ways you can build solution, and I will try to cover something on MFA, which recently started as a mandatory. But this is more on how single sign-on works in depth. What are the parts it get involved, and what are the different ways of authentication, authorization happens around Salesforce based on my experience. Okay, and if any questions, you can use a chat feature to post questions. I'll pause the session in between for the questions, but I'll try to cover as many as demo possible. I got 3 lined up, but based on time, let's see how much we can do today. So again, this will be recorded and available for future reference. So before we jump in, a little bit about myself. My name is Manoj Sonawane. I kind of 20+ year IT experience, done half of the career on .NET and half of career on Salesforce technology. So currently I'm working as a senior solution architect, mainly on the Salesforce platform for Simpson Strong Ties, one of the big manufacturing in Bay Area. I'm based out Bay Area, and apart from my job, I do I basically heading the Mountain House where I live. It's East Bay, so developer user group. I'm a leader for that developer user group. I presented one of the session in Trailhead DX in past. And yeah, I attended the last 2021 Dreamforce in person. That was for very limited people. I also participated in some of the fields they are released last year. Since in Bay Area we get some opportunities, so I mean they had a couple of shots for one of the film for they produced for Salesforce tour, and the Dreamforce film also. Yeah, got a little snapshot on that. Apart from this, I also work as a chief technology architect for one of I'm part of co-founder list for those Lead X360 as another product, working with them. So those are my most of the stuff, and I also do volunteering for Supermoms. Supermoms is it's kind of a cohort-based training program for Salesforce, the moms or dads who want to get back to the work after a break or transition from different teams. So this paid course, and they have pretty good course on admin, developer, marketing, and I help them for mentoring for their cohorts. So doing some last 3-4 years. And again, on technology side, Salesforce is my core. I do a lot of development on React, JavaScript. Some of the includes Babylon.js, 3D visualization, integration space as well. Like I work on majorly on Boomi, APIs, middleware, lots of stuff. Like MuleSoft and all. So yeah, I participate in those also, some of the technical discussions here, user groups. And yeah, I play some of the sports, and yeah, these are my favorites ones. So that's about me. So again, before we jump in, I would say I'm not an identity expert. This is purely based on my experience. There are various use cases you can build and deploy and integrate in different way, and everybody will have different opinions. So this is based on I've been doing last 10 years on the identity side. So today's agenda will cover some of the concepts of identity management, why single sign-on first place, understanding the 2 different flows of single sign-on. One is IDP initiated and SP initiated. We'll talk about what is IDP, SP, and then some of the OAuth flow. So OAuth has its own. OAuth is its own number of flows, and we won't be able to cover anything here, but we'll just briefly talk about how OAuth works and all those things. And there are other options also for authorization Salesforce provides, so like a Facebook and Google provider. So we'll talk about that if time permits. So let's get straight on the main session. So very first thing is like we talk about authentication, right? And the question is, who are you? So that's basically the identity where you can relate this question with the answer. And that answer is basically where we do the authentication. So if you think about the enterprise world, so whenever you try to log into your workstation, the identity is your username password, and that's always the answers for the who are you. And with the recent changes on the security and this remote work policies, a lot of companies are enforcing the additional credentials along with username password to identify who you are, kind of second factor authentication or MFA. So these are two different things, but works in similar way, like a multi-factor authentication, where like an additional security token or additional questionnaire or whatever it is to identify its you. So that's the authentication, and that's how the authentication piece work. And in some of the scenarios, certificates is also one of the authentication mechanism. So that's about the enterprise world. So let's talk about in real world, like as a consumer, how do you identify yourself? Who are you? So if you go to any hotel reservation and you want to check in, right? So the very first they will ask your identity, and that's your DL. And that's your identity, and that's what the authentication works. So they identify you based on the driving license and your photo, and yeah, that's you. And that's how you provide access to your hotel key and you check in. So there are a variety of ways you can think about how the authentication works. And that's nutshell is the authentication piece, where we're gonna see how the single sign-on can be built to do that seamlessly, where the enterprise might have multiple apps or programs where you don't have to maintain multiple username and passwords. So we move on to the next part of the identity is once you authenticated. So next is what can you do, and that's where the authorization kicks in, which is you can do part of the ownership. I mean, you cannot do everything. It depends on your authorization, the way we set up the profiles and permissions, where admin can do everything, or the sales guy can only access few other things. So that's where the talk about authorization. And authorization works differently and everywhere. So some of the things like where we talk about OAuth. So OAuth is basically is the mechanism to authorize, and a lot of time you see like you go to Workbench and try to connect your org, so you get a screen pop allow access. So that's basically kicks in the OAuth and asking to authorize access to that org's data or metadata, whatever you're going to, and that's where you're agreeing. So how authorization works in general terms. So let's say Valid Key. Valid Key has a specific set of actions where it can start a car, lock the doors, and basically you cannot open the trunk. So it has some authorization, but not the full authorization. That's in a nutshell the authorization works. Similarly, going back to our hotel example, where now you got a key, you can open your room, you cannot open another room and go to a cafeteria. Maybe you can go to gym or some pool. That's you got access. But where the manager of that hotel room, so he has access to all the rooms and all the storage and everywhere. So he has a different authorization compared to you, and that's how we can separate out the authorization. So these are two really basic concepts everybody understands, but in in technology world, we cannot see how those gets implemented, how those transitioned, and how those basically play around with the single sign-on and some of the standard mechanisms. All right. So moving on the basics of identity management, right? So there are parts of those which we need to understand in background how those works. So first thing is like a session tracking mechanism. So session tracking mechanism, how the session is persisted, so once you authenticate it, right, you need to make sure the session is valid for certain amount of time, and it needs to be persisted somehow, maybe the cookies, maybe URL rewriting, or maybe the hidden form fields, or some of the SSL sessions. So that's where when you implement, or when you a single sign-on solution and you have some troubles and you want to debug, or you want to find out what's going on, so you need to understand how the session is persisted, how it's transitioned, what are the expiries and all those things. So that's where it talks about session tracking mechanism. Then the network security basics. So in network security basics, you can say about the physical layer, which is basically where the connection is established, and which basically the system is calling what system. So let's say you're starting from some identity provider like Okta, and then you're connecting to Salesforce, and that's how. So you need to understand which system is talking to which system in high level. That's called physical layer, and how basically they're established using what protocol and how they exchanged. And the higher level basically is like a net security level, or the firewall things, because most of the enterprise world, there are lots of security protocols followed. So you need to understand what goes in, what goes out, and when this basically interaction between two systems happens over the internet or over the network, how those are going to compromise, or how those could be implemented on those lines. So maybe the IP address, what IP address is coming, what IP is going, basically whether it's on HTTPS or different protocols. So so those are the things talks about higher level security things. So as in nutshell, actually, you shouldn't understand when you are talking about or implementing single sign-on solution. So how the session is persisted, which systems are talking, how they're talking, and then you will be able to figure out the issues or anything happens on that. So next thing is like the broker communication. So when we are considering Salesforce is a SaaS-based cloud application. And most of the time, our broker is like a browser. Everything happens through the browser. And then, so that's our media. And then if you're connecting from one system to another system, or passing the tokens or whatever, so that goes through the HTTP request, and that happens to the browser. So you should be able to understand where to parse it, where to look into that. And that's where the broker comes in. And then last thing is the protocols, so single sign-on protocols. So there are a variety of ways to implement single sign-on, right? So one of the thing is like a SAML based single sign-on, which is very commonly used, and we're gonna see that today, how it's implemented, how it's configured with some of the tool or some of the identity provider. So there's a WS Federation. That's another way, federated way of doing single sign-on. And OAuth also has some of the ways to do a single sign-on as authentication part. Then OpenID basically works with OAuth. And then the other way, like a old-fashioned way, mainly for the systems, is Kerberos. So you might have heard about that. So there are a variety of ways to implement the single sign-on. But SAML is a very standard protocol because it works on XML, and it's industry standard, and that's why every system it's easy to integrate with SAML, and that's why that works in most of your SaaS world or cloud-based scenarios. Okay. So any questions so far on any of these items? We can pause here and take those questions, and then we can move on for the next items.
No. Okay.
Okay. So before we talk about IDP, SP, so let's go through some of the definitions. So SAML is again, it's a industry standard XML-based security assertion markup language. At the end, I have some resources, the links which explains SAML in detail, the structure, if you want to understand what goes where and how those are structured. Some of the videos also I have, which is in-depth talks about SAML. So we'll be talking about SAML, which is basic the main markup language which carries the tokens to implement a single sign-on. The OAuth is basically the authorization mechanism. It's open standard authorization that basically has a version 1.0, 2.0. 2.0 is latest, and that's where it's industry standard where all the APIs or wherever you want to connect to system without entering any credentials seamlessly on backend. So that's where OAuth is used, and you will see when you try to implement any API integration through the code or through the any third-party like a SaaS or cloud-based solutions, you use OAuth like connected app in Salesforce, and then you connect using the different keys instead of credentials. So that's a secure way of dealing with the authorization. The federation. So this next federation is another way of looking at it. Like so how the federation works is basically. So I know person A, and person A knows person B. So that's a chain. Now, so person B can trust me because person A says, I trust Manoj. So it's like a same works in system. And that's how the single sign-on is like one of the federation way where the token base and the trust base mechanism. And the identity provider is like a system that creates, maintains, and manages all those identity informations for providing the authorized services. It doesn't mean like it is like storing all the its main system of records where we store the credentials, but it syncs with the whichever the main system of records where the credentials stored. Like for example, Active Directory is your main storage for your credentials for your enterprise but if you put an identity provider in front of them, so it will be syncing that and making sure it does the authentication for you. So this is the main system where it will facilitate single sign-on and other solutions. There are a variety of IDPs in market. We use Okta at my workplace, which is very popular, and there are others as well. You can build your own. I built one in my one of my past company using the whole .NET framework, the custom solution, which basically acts as a IDP, and we sync with one of the cloud-based credential provider and like that. So it can be anything, but that's your main system which triggers the authentication, and that's where it knows which system to trust and not. And that's where the next term is service provider. Service provider is basically the system or entity where actually it provides service, right? Like a Salesforce or Workday, all those up, or maybe your marketing application, whatever it is. So So service provider is basically is providing service, but identity provider is basically allowing you access to those services. And that's where these two terms you'll hear majorly. And then again, the broker is the middleware, how that all this communicated. And so those are the terms I would just want to go through. Everybody understands what does mean by IDP, what does mean by SP, what does mean by federation, and that basically clears out how the SSO world works. Okay. Get this. Okay, so now let's look at the real problem. Why do we need a single sign-on, right? And why does this federation exist, like the trust-based claim, what we just explained, right? So let's say as a genesis, there are three systems and one user try to access maybe his LMS system, his HR system, and maybe some payroll system. And every system has a different username password. And since it's three, I can pretty much remember three passwords and I can go from there. But now company decides, okay, let's put everything under Active Directory. And that way everybody authenticates using the Active Directory. And that gives a leverage them to onboarding, offboarding the employees so that they can, if you are leaving the company, they can control who can access, who cannot. So one credential, three systems, and that's pretty easy, and that's very common scenario we might have seen. Now, the next challenge is, okay, these are all enterprise inbuilt software, so which can easily go with a Windows authentication using Active Directory. What about this new things like a SaaS-based cloud apps? So a lot of like a Workday or Salesforce, or maybe the dimensions which is used for as HR applications. So there are lots of these are on cloud-based, and that doesn't go well with what we have right now, right? So that's our next challenge. And can we use Active Directory here? If you try, then probably you'll see what is the issue here. I mean, you can use technically, but that's not a best practice. So let's say you say, okay, I want to use Active Directory credentials for my Salesforce login. What you can do, basically, you can dump all those credentials on somewhere storage on the Salesforce side, and then allow authentication through that, which is not a good practice. And again, what will happen in those scenarios, those two repositories who are storing the credentials, those will not be synced. And in the case of onboarding, offboarding, mainly the offboarding, if someone leaves the company, you won't be able to deal with those very easily outside the Salesforce. And that way, basically, we are losing the trust here. I mean, these two are totally different system. Mechanism of the credential management is totally different, and you cannot mix up those. And that's where basically what we can do to make it work with our Active Directory credentials. And that's where basically, okay, so we come up with a single sign-on solution, which is trust-based and which is claim-based. So where here's your Active Directory, which basically stores all your credentials, and those are synced with your IDP, which can be any IDP. For example, here, let's talk about Okta. And that will be like a maybe daily job or weekly job or maybe hourly job, or you can set up that. And that's how it knows who's what, and that provides you authorization. And these are all solutions, they work based on the trust, right? The trust based on the claims. So again, if identity provider says, okay, I know Manoj and I can allow access, you can allow access to access Salesforce. And that's where the trust-based, claim-based tokens are exchanged between these systems, and then you get access. How that happens? So that's where basically when we set up a single sign-on, there's a 509 certificate, which is basically exchange between these two providers. And that basically, okay, if identity provider generates one certificate, which is having public key, and that is when we configure, it is given to the service provider and it added into service provider's list. Whenever someone want to, access or get authentication, so it goes back to identity provider. Identity provider knows, okay, I know this guy because it is connected with me with that certificate, and IDP has the actual private key, and that's how it identifies that. And so that's basically trust-based protocol here, and then it returns back the token. So if you dissect the SAML token through the broker, you can see everything going through that. Maybe I'll show that in demo. So that's a IDP SP architecture where all the magic happens, and single sign-on is basically works in this part. Okay, so these are the common IDPs, which I was talking, like Okta, One Login, RSA. It was with the Dell, I guess, and not a separate entity. Ping Identity, Secure Auth. There's IBM's. This is DOE Citrix one. Or Cisco one, I guess, and Oracle has its own identity management, access management suite. Microsoft has the Azure 8, which is again the single sign-on also. So everywhere, it depends on use cases, depends on your priorities. So we use Okta. Most of the companies I work, they use Okta, and they provide sophisticated way of doing single sign-on, and like a whole administration way. It's easy way. You don't have to go into in-depth of what goes where. You just configure it and can plug in, turn off. And talking about MFA, so if you're using any SSO provider for logging to Salesforce, so that completely MFA turning on, turning off, and what mechanism you want to use for authentication. Using the MFA, that remains on the provider side. So for example, for our company, we use Okta, and we define Okta app, which is the provider. That will be the default for everyone to get this one-time token and basically pass the MFA. And then whoever doesn't have that phone or kind of thing, then we're gonna provide them security keys. We don't use Salesforce inbuilt MFA in this scenario because everything goes through single sign-on. Only the admins who go backdoor to Salesforce, they have both way. They need to use Salesforce MFA, inbuilt MFA. So that's a major difference, and that's what we're being rolled out this month. Okay, so these are basic stuff about single sign-on and how those things are played together. Now we're going to talk about some of the flows, and we jump into those demos, and then I'll show you how that works. So the first is the IDP.
Here, Manoj.
Yeah, sure.
There's a question.
So do you want to ask this, or?
We got a question in chat.
Yeah, I guess I was just thinking, I think of Entrust as being one of the companies that was doing the secure validation and stuff. Isn't it an IDP as well?
What's that?
Entrust is a Ottawa-based, Canadian-based company that's doing
yeah, it might be. Yeah, I'm not sure. Might be, as long as it provides the way you set up your. I mean, one is to sync with your actual credential system. Yeah.
All right. Just a question that came to mind as I was looking at the list.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very common, popular list if you go to Gartner, and these are like some standard providers, but there might be small players. There are a lot of, and as I mentioned, I built my own in my past company, which is custom solution, because we wanted to store the session in a different fashion, and we want to have multiple parts of session into a cookie so that we can play around, and there are lots of customized things. So we build our own, which is sometimes these IDPs have different limitations.
I have a quick question here, Manoj. So for all these like IDP, right? Like my understanding is they are not a standalone system. So all these systems need to working with internally, like with for example, enterprise or company, they need to work with certain like a directory or like a user management tool, correct?
Right. So they are like mainly they might have some of like Azure AD. It has a cloud-based Active Directory, and then it provides this IDP solution as well. But it depends if you're on-premise Active Directory and you want to have mixed solution, then yeah. But these are all, most of them are cloud-based SaaS solutions, independent, and it can go with that. Some of them might have credential management, but yeah, it depends on your enterprise, how you manage that users and all.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Okay, so if no more questions, we can go ahead with the next item, which is how the flows work. So IDP initiated SAML flow is, you can look into this diagram. So the first thing happens here is the basically configuration, which is a handshake between two systems. That's the number one step, where I can see there's some settings. I'm going to use Axiom tool in my demo. Axiom tool is basically provided by Labs to test your single sign-on or understand how that works, those kind of things. And basically you'll see this configuration, and in order to trust them each other, you have to exchange the certificate, and that's how we do the first step. Then as we basically so IDP initiated, meaning like you go to IDP, you log IDP, IDP authenticates you, and you are already in IDP. And then now you're saying, okay, I want to access Salesforce. And then that's where it's basically, it sends the response, I mean, the SAML response back to the Salesforce. And that's where this like step 5 here, which basically carries the SAML assertion to the Salesforce. So you get basically one whole post response, which carries all your information, and then log is to Salesforce via those assertion token. So there are other parameters in that assertion token. Mainly one is the certificate, which identifies. Salesforce says, okay, I see this guy is coming and it has valid certificate, and then it try to authenticate him in Salesforce way and establish Salesforce session. But how do you know it's Manoj or someone else? So for that purpose, there are some additional items or attributes which pass into the same token, which identifies it's based on this user A or user B. So we'll go through that. So that's, I mean, pretty straightforward initiated flow, meaning you start your request from the IDP. You're not coming from some other link or something. You go to your Okta, log in there, and then click on the dashboard and Salesforce app, and then you start there, or your IDP and start there. So it's always like you just kicking this off from the IDP. The second scenario is SP initiated, which is where, let's say you have some deep linking or some bookmark, some email link where asking you to open the report, which is a secure page, and you click on that, and that's where you start your flow from the Salesforce side, and you're trying to access a secure page on Salesforce, but you're not authenticated, and then Salesforce say, oh, I don't know you, and then it knows where to redirect you. It will send you back to the IDP URL where you first log in, authenticate yourself. And once you'll authenticate, it will send back the token, and then and it will show that secure page. So that's another flow. Sometimes you have to restrict that. Sometimes you have to implement differently. It depends on different IDPs, but you need to make sure both the flows are working together in all the scenarios when you implement single sign-on. Okay, so let's get into first demo, which is a IDP initiated SAML flow. So as I mentioned, I'm gonna use the, let me switch to the different screen. Okay, so this is the tool I'm gonna use for my demo. So this is by Salesforce Labs, and they have code available on GitHub to fork and look into this. So on this, you can see a variety of things. One is a SAML IDP and tester, and then OAuth tester. So if you want to check it out, OAuth, how that works and all those things, you can use this OAuth tester. And for the SAML, it's pretty much straightforward here, how you're gonna configure and how basically that works. So the very first thing here is in order to set up our IDP. This is IDP. I mean, this is our IDP in this scenario, and our SP is Salesforce, which is my trial org, which I just set up yesterday night. So the very first thing on the SP side is single sign-on settings, and you need to basically edit and check this checkbox enables SAML enabled. So once you enable this, it will allow you to create new SAML settings. So I already have one setup, which is our for the second scenario, but I'm gonna set up one fresh for the Axiom. You can have multiple here, and the way we set up here is there are multiple ways. Like you can create manually, you can download the metadata file from the IDP, upload it here, or you can get some URL from IDP XML, it has XML, and then upload it. For some reason, I guess these features are having some issues. They are still working on those, but we're gonna create manually. And so this is our SP, Salesforce side, and this is our IDP, which is Axiom. To start with, you need to download the certificate, which I already downloaded on my desktop. And then need to go to setup and do the rest of the things. So, okay. So I'll generate one SAML response here, and you can see you can get option of 1.1, 2.0, 2.1 is latest. We'll use that. We'll come back to this. So the very first thing here is asking for issuer. Now let's do the same here. New set. Okay, so I'll put this like a Axiom. Now issuer is the name or ID provider of the IDP, so it has to match. So whatever you put here saying name, that has to match into your configuration on the Salesforce side. So I'll use the Axiom here, and I'll use the same here. Now, the next thing is basically it's asking for here certificate. So I already have the certificate, and then I can go back to my location to pull the certificate. Come on. Okay, so this is the certificate. Now, the rest of the things like how the signature method you can use, there are different encryptions here. The decryption, how the assertion decryption works. Probably you can use your certificate, self-signed certificate on Salesforce side to do that decryption to make it more secure. I'll leave it as a default. And there are a bunch of options here like identity type. Now, as I mentioned, okay, you got the token, but Salesforce doesn't know whom to access. Either it's Manoj or it's someone else. So this is the part where you define, okay, how do you want to send that name ID parameter as part of token? Is it a username, or it's like employee ID, or some different mechanism? So there are multiple options here. We'll keep it like a username as a default. And then, so these are like specific attribute, what you want as part of this name ID and the subject statement. So those are default one. If you want like a attribute element separately, then you can define those also. But let's go with standard, and this is a post mechanism. Sometimes HTTP redirect also possible in some of the scenarios, but we'll use post here. Now, so there are two key things here. One is the identity provider login and the identity ID. So these are again coming from the Axiom side. So this is the entity ID. Now, if your entity ID, I mean, they have option to use instead of SAML, you can use your domain, like this domain itself in that entity ID. So let's try with what they have given. Okay, straight away. And then identity provider login is basically, this is the page, which if at all, if someone goes directly to Salesforce, then it doesn't know where to send you, right, for authentication. So the Salesforce will say, I don't know you, then that's for our second scenario, S page, that will send you to this URL, and then it will authenticate and come back here. Okay, so pretty much these are the important things here, and you can save this configuration. So there's another option here, user provisioning enabled. So we'll do that in next part. But so now once you save this, yeah, got a question, Fred?
Yeah, or I just wanted to make a comment just to provide our own experience. So when you were looking at what to use, a username or federation ID, we had an experience where we had people from multiple systems. So sometimes the user ID would not be something that we could easily get from the system that was doing our SSO. So, you know, just so people know, Federation ID in Salesforce is basically just a field. It's just a field.
Yeah, it's just a field. You can use any ID, like a phone number or maybe employee ID or anything. So
right. So
yeah.
what we ended up doing was, you know, basically getting from the SSO. In our case, it was Azure. That would just export the data that aligned with each user and add it to the Federation ID. That was a little bit easier for us.
Yeah, correct. So so moving on here, I'm just gonna come back here and put this login URL, right? Sorry, here, login URL, where to start. So you can see here, start URL release state. So when you done with authentication, we need to instruct IDP saying, okay, take this guy to this page, home page or default page. So this release state basically carries, if you're coming in scenarios where redirection or deep linking or bookmark, so it knows, it carries that URL after authentication, take this guy to maybe account page, which he requested, or reports page. So that's the release state carries. But the start URL basically always like your home page. And so that's pretty much here. And then the next thing is required is a username or federation ID. So I'm going to use a username here. So my username here is okay. So this is my username, and then we can try sending the SAML response and see whether we can log in using the this mechanism. Okay, so let me log out from here to make sure I don't have any session. All right, and then let's request SAML. So you can see it generated SAML, and then this is the formatted SAML response, right? So which carries, this is my security. Okay, let me make it more bigger. So this is my X509 certificate. It has that in my assertion. And then it has a couple more things like the name ID. So it has my username. So when it logins, it knows to whom to give authorization, I mean authentication. And there are a bunch of things, and then it's basically the expiry, the time. So the way it works is, I mean, there's another point to consider. Your IDP and whatever the systems you are using, those should be in same time zone or should be in line with that, because there's a very less amount of time between these tokens, and sometimes you end up having those exceptions if you're like your IDP is on-premise and somewhere in different time zone, and you're trying to connect with some different system on different time zone. It will never match, and then it will never allow you to log in. So those are the things basically as a enterprise what you need to make sure. But again, here your response is encoded base 64, and that goes through your broker, and you can use some tools to see this response in SAML way. There's like some Chrome extensions and all those things. So let's give a try to log in. Let's see whether it works. Okay. Okay, so looks like some issue. I mean, probably I haven't set up something. So I think because of domain, it's not taking me the way I'm doing the SAML configuration. Now, let me go backdoor and see how we can correct this. Okay. So log in here at the backdoor with my credentials, and then go back to settings. Okay, so we got an error, but how do you see that error, right? So there's another way to review that error. So here's a tool they have given, and then you can pretty much understand here what's happening. So on one of the subject connection data element is missing, the recipient field. So probably the recipient field is not correct here, and that's what is failing. And whenever you have any issues, you can go to this tool and understand what is happening, why this single sign-on is not working. Okay, so let's go back to this one. So what is missing here? Let me do some changes here. Okay. Okay, I'll go back to here and find out some of the things from here. So this is the one I'm using mainly for because I have domain setup entity ID. Instead of using the standard one, I'm using my specific domain. Okay, and then the rest of the things are pretty much same. So let's go back to the previous configuration. So I'll change this to my domain. I can see certificate is applied here. And then we have this provider login, save, and then go back to the Axiom. Okay, so here, put the same. Okay, and then okay, you can see it worked. So the reason it didn't work because nowadays I guess we don't. I mean, when I did this like last year, my domain was something you have to build your, set up your own. Now, when you spin your DevOps, they already give domain, by default. That step is now, Salesforce already taking care, and you can rename that. But so if you have domain, basically you try to stick to domain, and that's how the both configuration should go. And then you have to make sure, when you set up using the Okta or anything, so they have pretty nice instruction page, what goes where and all those things. So I'll pull that next since I already configured. But this is a simple way on how this goes. Again, going back here, you should understand what goes in here, what is included, what is not. If you want to debug and find out the issues and all those things. But again, on the settings, let's say you want to debug, there's a tool they provided, and that's a simple setup. You can set up your single sign-on. Now, there are lots of things to be considered. Its setup is one thing, but how you enforce everyone goes to single sign-on, how you make sure your login screens are changing from normal login to this one. Again, who can get a backdoor, who not. And since now MFA is a new thing, how the MFA is played between these two. So there are lots of things you need to understand. And there's another thing here is like a just-in-time provision, where you have ability to change some of the user profile details during the sign-on process itself. So how do we do that? You need to turn this on. Probably I'll not show that, but we turn this on feature. So it says user provision enabled. So you go back here. In this tool, they have given like a JIT provisioning, right? Guidelines. So you can say my last name something. I can provide this attribute here, and I can add multiple attributes here. So these IDPs provide very sophisticated way to do this. They have like a mapping and so many things, and you can say you change your profile on Okta side or Active Directory, that changes the same information in your next systems, like whichever you're authenticating. Like if you change your name, if you change your phone number, something in Active Directory, it should sync back to all the system. And that's where this just-in-time provision kicks in. Only you won't be able to do is like a deletion of users. You probably can disable those, but deletion is not feasible. And that's where like onboarding, offboarding, and seamless sync between all the profiles from the Active Directory can be achieved through this. And then, yeah, if you say request SAML, so you can see that part, new attribute is included here. Yeah, the additional attribute is here. And when you turn on this provisioning on the other side, it respects that, and it will apply the same change on the user profile to rename that last name. Okay, so that's a just-in-time provision. If you go back to any IDP, so you should know what is that, how that works, and all those things. All right. So next thing is, let's go back again here, and I don't want to use my username. Let's say I use my phone number. And then let's say request SAML, and then try to let me log out. Yeah, it should throw the error. I mean, I was expecting this too. So now what happened? I'm saying log me in, but Salesforce doesn't know who's this guy, 41585. So I'm saying use my federation ID. Salesforce doesn't know this guy. So if I want to change from username to federated ID, so I need to make some corrections here. So probably I need to go as a backdoor again. Let Okay. Okay. So I'm gonna say use different option now instead of username federated ID. So that's the one step here you have to do if you don't want to use username and all those things. So save this, and then you have to go to my user profile, and there will be a field. Let me go to advanced settings, edit. There's a field. Yeah, this one. So they have provided this field where you can put whatever ID you want to identify. It has to match. So if company defines, okay, everyone log in through employee ID or everyone log in through some key provided by them as a enterprise solution. So you need to make sure those are updated in Salesforce side, and then the single sign-on will start working. So if I say save, and then probably about, let's give a try again. Yeah, it worked. So it took my new ID identifier, which was my federation ID. So likewise, I mean, that's pretty simple, looks simple, but there are so many around the things which every day we struggle. I can show you a couple things to consider. Mainly like if someone goes to login.salesforce.com, what needs to be done. So how we do this, once you enable the single sign-on and everything's done, so we have to go to each profile, enable the single sign-on so that they don't maintain any credentials in Salesforce anymore. When you reset their password and all, you don't have to do that. And even if you reset, they will not receive any email because they are single sign-on users. They rely on the IDP. That's number one. Second thing is like if you go to my domain, so now if I always go to this domain, it will show me some options to log in. So if you see here, so you have other options like prevent login from login.salesforce.com. But it has some issues like if you prevent that, even admin cannot log in through this backdoor entry. So we have to do some mix. Again, here you can see the form, and you can see you get 3 more options here because I configured 2 more single sign-on methods here. You can have n number of different groups might have different mechanism to log in. Maybe partners might be logging through their single sign-on, your main site is logging through main company provider single sign-on. You can throw these options here on your screen, and you can just say, take this login form out. And then if you go to, okay, so if you go to this URL, I'll open Cognito. So you see, you'll get these 2 options, and then it will take you to that IDP, and then you authenticate from that IDP, and then you go from there. Even for the mobile apps, you go to use your custom domain, and then you get the same options here. So those are the things you should need to be considered. I need to make sure I have backdoor log it is available. So I'll just enable this back. So those are some best practices. You need to review all those policies, what goes, what not. You got a question, Kevin?
Yeah, hi, I have a question here. So you mentioned, so as admin, system admin will be exempted from the single sign-on by default. Is that correct?
No, not that lightweight. If you go to login.salesforce.com,
yeah,
so that will never enforce you single sign-on because this is the generic way of logging to Salesforce.com. If you go to your domain, like this one, this you can control. So you can say all single sign-on users go to this site for
Okay.
login to Salesforce.
Okay.
They never go to, we'll never allow anyone to go to login.salesforce. I mean, they're smart people. They know how to, they can cheat that. But if you do that, then they will probably get a prompt of username password, which is like this is generic page. This doesn't know your org. This doesn't know anything about your org.
Yeah.
So you can completely disable for your org. But the drawback here is like even admins won't be able to log in using the backdoor side credentials. Admins also have to go to single sign-on always. And that's not good because there has to be some backdoor users in case some emergencies or something, your IDP is down or in those scenarios.
Yeah.
So we keep this on, but we enforce everyone to go single sign-on, and that's where we don't reset their password or anything. Lots of people confuse this mostly in mobile apps because mobile apps, we cannot change that screen, login screen. It always show credential and then custom domain. So there's one extra step. You have to choose a custom domain, enter this custom domain, and then it will pop up your single sign-on. So that's the education that's here to teach your users to make sure these are the only paths for you to log in. And that's how you have to get everyone on single sign-on.
For single sign-on, like if single sign-on is turning on in org, like for everyone, is there a way to, like, for example, giving a permission set or something to examine people or user from single sign-on?
Yeah, I mean, that's a permission set on profile. So if you go to profile,
yeah,
there's a one set, a permission set. Okay, let me see this custom one. Okay, so here, let me find out setting. Yeah, there's a one permission set which talks about single sign-on, which you need to turn on. Okay, and then only they will basically exempted from the credential reset and everything. Yeah, somehow my dev org is different, but I will provide the links at the end, which has all those guidelines, what needs to be done, what not. But there's a settings on every profile. So you have to make sure every profile has the two settings turned on, which is says single sign-on user, single sign-on user. And then from there, they will be making sure there's the password credential. They don't have to be exempted. I mean, they should be exempted from the password reset and all those things. So that's how they basically become part of the single sign-on feature. And then they have option to use passwords and all, but as long as we don't reset and all, you don't have password, then you don't have to worry on those things. Okay.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, I'll provide those links at the end. I don't know, this is my dev org, but so permission sets. Probably can show up here. Yeah, I don't know, DevOrg has something different here. I never seen that. But yeah, you will have one of the permission set which does that. Okay, let's move on to the next part. Okay, so so far we've seen IDP initiated flow, how that works, the username federation, ID plus JIT, I mean the just-in-time provision. So let's go back to the next setup. I mean, still have maybe some time. Let me go back to the slide. Okay. Okay. So the next thing is like a SP initiated SAML flow where it works most of the time as same, but you see step one is same as a configuration between these two systems. And then you basically attempt to log in via bookmark or deep link. So you got some page and then anyone talking? Can you go on?
Hey, Dave, can you mute yourself?
Yeah, thank you. So instead of going to Okta to log in first, you basically just click that link, which is secure, and that's where it goes to Salesforce. And Salesforce says, I don't know you. It sends back to you to all the way to the provider. That's where it knows if it don't know how to authorize you, then it will ask the IDP, which we have provided the link into the configuration. And that's where this number 4, it goes to Okta. Okta will come back and ask you credentials, and then authentication happens here. And then number 7, basically you get the SAML assertion token, and then it goes back to Salesforce and then say, okay, I know this guy, now you can present that secure page. So that's pretty much happens behind the scene, the basically the dance between two systems. You probably not realize what's happening, but this is a little different. And some of the companies, I'm not on the SaaS kind of solution, but some of the systems, they don't allow to manage users on other side. They don't allow the user to log into this flow. They always have to go to one way, other way. And so it works differently and in different scenarios, right? But in Salesforce world, yeah, this is pretty much common, and deep linking and all those things important to consider. Okay, so now I'm gonna show this SP initiated SAML flow. Probably for that, I'll go back to again a browser. So now, before we jump into the actual SP initiated flow, probably it works same. I want to show you the IDP configuration in sophisticated way. One I show with the Axiom, which is a tool, but let's say you get to work on Okta, something like that, and how do we do that? So to save some time for our discussion, I pre-configured that, but I'll walk you through the steps. Because in last demo, it took a lot of time and back and forth. We just wasted some time. So yeah, so let's go back to here. Single sign-on settings. So you see here Okta, which is I configured, and then I will log into Okta. Okay. This is my trial org of Okta. So Okta has a 30 days trial org. If you want to try your solution, something, you can try it out, but it only takes your email, which is corporate email, not any personal email. So this is already configured, but let's go to the admin. Let me log into the admin, and the Okta has its own MFA. So we are using pretty much Okta Verify app for MFA. So similar thing, if you're using single sign-on with Okta, you need to do the same with your MFA implementation for Salesforce. Okay, so here on Okta side, you see the applications. You can create a new app, and you can basically create new app integration, or you can browse the catalog. They have kind of give you a variety of apps predefined, and you just implement that. So Salesforce is one of them. Now, when you do here, you can find out Salesforce. Yeah. So, or you can create new using like their given templates. So there's ServiceNow, Workday, lots of stuff. All right, so let's go back to our app. So once you create that, you will see something like this. And so first thing will be, it will ask you some of bunch of details like name, where to connect, and the custom domain. So this is my domain from my Salesforce org. Okay, and that's where basically it differentiates the login and everything for your org. And then you can provide a bunch of additional details here, but these are pretty much standard. And then there are variety ways to embed this. Someone is talking. Kevin, can you mute them? Okay, so in this setup only, you need to provide custom domain. That's the number one. And then in the next part of this setup, so you have to choose the mechanism. Like there are variety ways to do single sign-on. Okta provides, but let's say we choose single sign-on with the SAML 2.0. And then in 2.0, once you set up that, you will get this nice setup instructions. Okay, so that's where I mean the metadata URL, which we can basically create a new SAML configuration using this metadata URL. You can use this URL. It shows all the metadata. You can plug in this URL and it will capture all those certificate and name and everything. Most of things for you, but that feature is not working somehow. But this is also one of the better approach here is follow along this configuration. Now, it tells you what to do in Salesforce side with exactly the details, like following here it says, okay, let's go back to the configuration here.
I just mute someone.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Thanks. So here, issuer, you need to copy from something from setup. So there's the issuer name, which is generated by Okta. Certificate you can download here and then upload back in Salesforce. And then this provider login URL. So you need to provide provider login URL, which is here, and the certificate already here, and then entity ID. Again, they have provided the entity ID, what to provide based on our entity ID is here. Yeah, based on custom domain, it's asking you to use custom domain and not to use this one. And then logout URL when basically it goes back to the Okta. So straightforward things, and they have given all those instructions how to do that. And once you do that, it generates the login URL, logout URL, which you have to plug back into this configuration here, and then it knows how to go back and forth. Okay, so now this is active, this is set up. And the next thing on Okta side is basically since we did here username. So we're asking SAML to authenticate based on the username in Salesforce. So we need to make sure the same is configured on the other side. And that's probably the format I selected here, but when I say this is the app I created now, your Okta admin or your Exchange admin, they know, okay, I want to deploy this for a bunch of users, which is Salesforce users, and they might create a group and then add them, and then automatically take their credentials as part of that name ID, and it will authenticate you. But in my case here, my ID is different. So I basically plugged in this my ID during the assignment. So one is create the app, second assign the users here. When you assign the users, make sure they send the right credit, the username or federation ID, whichever is set up. So I plugged in my custom ID here and then done. So that's majority of things, steps are required here. And then we saw the provisioning, right? So there's a very sophisticated way to configure provisioning where you can create those mapping between user fields on the Salesforce side and the user fields from the Okta. And then whenever changes on Okta directory or Okta side, it syncs back and forth. So those things are managed here, and so all those IDPs provide very neat way for that. So now this app is ready, and I'm gonna do logout from this one. I'll make sure it works. So I'll go to my dashboard as an end user. When you log into Okta or any IDP, you will see the dashboard. You can have a bunch of other apps like a Workday or other stuff. So they will log in here, and then they will see this desktop, dashboard, and then click here. It should take me to my org. So my authentication is working fine. Now, how do I test my? Okay. So let's say I copy this account, specific account. So I get an email or something report, and I want to click that email, and that links text to me this URL. So let me copy this URL. Let me log out. Okay. So now I don't have any session here. Let me log out from everything. Let me log out here as well. Okay. So okay. So now I got this email and saying, okay, I want to open that link in browser, which will take me to the, this account, specifically Salesforce account. So if you click this, so you can see it is throwing you back to the login page because it doesn't know you. And since we have kept all three options, it's showing me login screen, Okta, Axiom. So in real scenario, you will have only one of those options. And basically what would happen, user will be taken to directly to the Okta login screen. So let's fix this, and then probably we'll see the option exactly what we are going to see. So let me directly log in here. Okay, so you should basically, if the previous screen, if we change our login policies to only Okta, the previous screen will show only this option where it will redirect you to this URL, and then user will get, okay, in order to log into Salesforce, you need to log into your IDP, and that's where I'm gonna do. Okay, now it logged in, it basically generated token, and it took me back to the Salesforce. It didn't bring me back to the Okta dashboard where you have to click or something. So it did all those steps which we were hoping into this screen. So basically all these 8 steps happen in this one click, and that's what exchange happened between request and response. So Salesforce sent back a request with a SAML request, and then Okta basically generated a SAML token response, and then how that ended here. So again, if I change something here, let's say I take out everything and I just say, okay, do this one only. And I say log out. I try this direct view. So you can see it didn't show me any login screen where I can choose between the username or Okta or Axiom. It directly took me to the IDP, which is configured as a primary solution, primary login provider. And then I do here same. So this will be most of the use case in your org or wherever you implement, and it does everything and takes you back to the Salesforce. So you need to consider both the scenarios, and that's how this is called SP initiated flow and the IDP initiated flow. If you are implementing outside Salesforce, this is more need to understand and need to be worked on. Or if you're building some product and which basically you're putting as a SaaS solution, then you need to make sure when you implement your solution as a SAML provider, you should work on both the scenarios. Okay, so that's why I wanted to enforce on these 2 flows. The next thing I'm gonna present on how much time we have, Kevin?
We have 30 minutes. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so we got some time. So next thing probably we'll go through some of the concepts on. So we saw this one. So OAuth flow. Okay, so OAuth is basically open authentication, and then this is pretty much very standard in APIs and middlewares and everywhere. So where, so as I mentioned, if you go to Workbench, right? That's most of the developers use a Workbench tool, and you see a pop-up saying allow when you're logging, and the pop is basically it's trying to do some authorization on behalf of your already logged in or a session, and or maybe, and that's where it asking you to OAuth permissions and it's going through. So why OAuth? So most of the scenarios like a middleware or APIs and all that's transmitted over the network, right? And the only way mechanism is to authenticate or authorize is passing the credentials. So OAuth basically eliminates that completely. You never use any credentials or passwords or anything, even if you're trying to call some APIs and all. It's token based. So and then the token is basically based on some of the established keys instead of username password. Those are like a one-time defined keys, like they call a client key and secret key, which is when you create a connected app in Salesforce, you will see that, and that's basically becomes your kind of credentials, but which are only works into OAuth flow. You cannot take that to somewhere else and do something else. And basically, it eliminates the entire password dependency. And so OAuth has like a variety of flows. There are almost 8-9 OAuth flows, which works in different scenario, different way. This is the one of the very common, which is a web server OAuth flow, which we see in day-to-day our implementations, like a Workbench is one of the feature I'm saying. But there's like a whole session on OAuth. I think I have those links into my resources, which talks about in depth each of the flow, how that works and how that configured, how that implemented. That's a big topic. So we're just gonna see in nutshell, like a single sign-on, how the OAuth is configured and how that works using our Axiom tool. Again, here, if you look at the flow, first is a configuration between this, let's say, Workbench is an example here, and Salesforce is a provider. So in these two scenarios, first thing is configuration. The second step is basically you attempt to log in Workbench. Web basically it redirects back to all the way Salesforce saying, yeah, someone is asking resources, and then it basically provides the couple of things like client ID and secret ID. It knows, Workbench knows which provider to go, and this is the provider. I mean, this is the details, and I'm basically asking for resources. And then in order to do that, you need to log into Salesforce first, authenticate yourself, and then once you authenticate, and then it knows, okay, it's a valid request coming from specific tool which is already configured with this client and all. So it does like a multiple steps we'll see in that Axiom. Like first is authorization code, which makes sure it knows it's a valid roles, and then it sends back to the rest of the items like a security key, and then it basically goes back and sends you the authentication token, which is like a time base, and that's where you get the pop-up saying allow access and all those things. So there are a lot of steps happen back and forth, but this is like a pretty secure, and this is very commonly used in mostly in API world and all those integrations. Okay, so let's go back to Axiom tool again. Now this Axiom tool has a OAuth tester as well. Now you can see 2.0, how the 2.0 works, the consumer and the Salesforce. So there's steps mentioned here, and same thing which I showed in the previous slide, but mainly like when you try to log in, it sends authorization code back here, and then grants access, and then basically goes back here. So these are the mainly what you're doing on the screen, and this is happening on the back end. And then once you get the token, you basically go next here. So let's 2.0. Now on 2.0 here, what we are seeing here is host, consumer key, and redirect URL. Now, the very first step for me is to go back to Salesforce. In my browser, okay. Okay, I'm already in Salesforce, so I need to create a connected app, which I already done, because it takes some time to set it up and settle it down. So go to App Manager, and you can basically, here's the option to create connected app. I'll show you that option. So here it will ask you a bunch of details, but one of the key thing here is start URL, or no, not this one. Yeah, one of the key thing is asking for the consumer URL, and that's what you get from here, this one. Okay, so let me go back to the My App, which I configured. This is a demo app, which is I configured. And if I go to edit, so you can see callback URL. Yeah, this is the URL where if you try to connect, then it knows where to send back. And so while setting up, you provide your bunch of details, but this is the important one, which is the callback URL. and the access. So you can define your access. Okay, I want this resource or this app only access maybe accounts or maybe specific things. You can pretty much scope it out. For example, DocuSign is a very another common example, or any digital signature where you have a coding tool in Salesforce and you want to generate a code with a DocuSign and digitally sign. Every time you create that and all, it needs to authenticate you with your DocuSign as well. So you can set up a auth between DocuSign and all. So it never exchange the password. It will just allow you to access DocuSign based on your credentials of Salesforce. It knows which user to give what access and all. So all it just like happens behind the scene using OAuth. And all you need to basically set up connected app here and do some bunch of settings on the DocuSign side, and then you're done. So those are pretty common scenarios where you need to have those integration inbuilt, and that's where the OAuth is used. Okay, so now once you set up this, you see okay, so once you set up this, you can see it generated something like a consumer key. So this is the key which we're gonna plug in here. Okay, and I'm gonna change this to my domain. Okay. Okay, this is my domain. I'll change this to my domain. So in this step, what will happen? So basically, trying to access some resource, it redirects me to Salesforce, asking for login, and then approves page and sends authorization code. And then once we see the authorization code, then it requests for access token. It grants the access token, and then it provides the actual resource. So this is where we basically requesting the authorization code, right? If I send this, okay, so it's saying, okay, you got this pop-up saying someone is trying to access resources, and do you want to allow access for this guy? And then you might have seen similar screen on Workbench or any other OAuth flows. And then once you allow, it basically gets you the access token. Okay, so next step is basically now you're authorized. Now it's time to retrieve the actual access tokens. So that's where you have one authorization code already here. Now it's asking for consumer secret, which is the next piece of this connected app, which is here. I can get this, copy this, and this is a one-time setup in your code or wherever you are integrating or application integration. So since I'm using this tool, we're doing this dynamically, but this is like a one-time setup on both the side, and then you're done. And then whenever someone tries, it knows how to connect to that using these two keys. And then you can say request access token. So you can see it's authenticated, and this is your access token. This is your refresh token. Refresh token is basically used when your access token is expired. It will have some expiry, and then you can basically get another access token using this token. So you don't have to go back to step one. So you can pretty much keep getting new access token from this step itself using as long as you have this one. So that's how systems are integrated. And then if you are doing integration between two systems, so you don't have to punch in the credential. You just punch in this client key, secret key, and set up connect app into Salesforce side, and then it knows how to connect. You can generate these tokens and keep, syncing whatever you're doing. So that's the OAuth in a nutshell, the web server flow, and pretty much it does the same what we have seen on the slides. Okay. So any questions so far?
Go ahead. Someone. Is someone talking previously? Okay, so I have a question regarding the connected apps. Like this is pretty cool. Like basically, the connected apps can be directly accessed within Salesforce once this is set up, right?
Yeah, let's say you have some marketing website and you are from there you want to go to access some Salesforce resource or the scenario which I mentioned, like a DocuSign or something. So there are a variety of ways where you don't have to provide passwords. So let's say I'm writing a .NET app and where I want to connect to Salesforce. So how do you connect those APIs? So the way we connect is OAuth way. So instead of plugging in credentials, basically generate their one-time IDs, and then there's a mechanism also how the APIs are got authenticated using OAuth. So this is one of the additional different flows. So if you look at the OAuth flows, I need to understand all those different flows in different scenarios. So this scenario is mainly like the apps, which is trying to access some resource from Salesforce and using it for your display purpose, like a workbench is a very common example. So it is different app together, but it is accessing Salesforce resources and showing that content. Same like you're using a Salesforce mobile app. You after your single sign-on done, login done, you still get a one screen which says allow access, and that's where it accesses everything through API. Make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So I think we'll not go deep dive into rest of the things, but I just want to quickly show some other mechanisms here, like there's an authorization provider in Salesforce. So let's say you don't want to use Okta, or you don't want to use Salesforce credentials, and you want to use like a social login, like a Facebook or Google or something else. So they have, and these all social, they have their own provider. So if you want to use Facebook login to log into Salesforce, then you have to use a Facebook application provider. And then again, there are lots of configuration on both the side, but there's a provision in Salesforce to create one of this provider as your authentication mechanism and do the setup on Facebook side, and then people can log in using their Facebook login or Google login or whatever it is. Or you can build your own authorization provider. So there's a way also to build your custom authorization provider through the Apex code, where you can build your own to integrate with something which is not defined into Salesforce. So you can explore that option. That's not very commonly used, but it depends on each of the scenarios. And there's there's a very good session on the Plural site. If you have seen any of the step-by-step series from the Don Robbins. So he has one of the session which talks about these all what I'm talking, single sign-on, providers and different mechanisms and how they play around Salesforce. So yeah, if you want to learn about that, then that's another way. This is delegated way, where delegated authorization flow is basically WSDL based, and there's an endpoint, and so it works in SOAP world. But again, I just wanted to walk you through what happens in behind what parts needs to be considered, best practices, and if you want to debug, there are lots of understanding to make sure go through. And then if you get a chance, this is a big video, but this is a really good video. I love this video. It talks about all the scenarios, why and why not. This is the one video which talks about OAuth completely. There are a couple more, I guess, on the same line, the Dreamforce videos. But yeah, that's probably that's it. Most of the things I wanted to share based on my experience. If any more questions, we can go through that again.